just learning about functions and for loops. Right, okay, so review of last session. We talked about using for loops to iterate over lists. Um, so one way we can do that is if we want to have a loop run a certain number of times, we can define a range. So a range will just give us a list of numbers from 0 to 1 less than the given number. So this range will be the range from 0 to 4, not including 5. So here, it's a list of 5 numbers, so we loop through the list 5 times if we pass that in. Okay. Another thing we're going to look at is a different way to get mouse inputs in processing. So previously, we've used the mouse pressed function to do something when the mouse button is pressed. So this is a simple function that will return true if you have a mouse button pressed down and false if not. So here's an example of how that would be used. So we can add mouse press to our code the same way we have setup and draw, and create a function to do something when the mouse button is pressed down. So whatever we write under mouse press will run once whenever we press the mouse button. So for example, let's say every time we press the mouse button down, we want to draw an ellipse. This will let us do that. Okay, so all three of these are examples of functions that we can create and define. So let's look at some other uses of functions. So as we know, a function is a block of code with a name that we can call that performs a single task. So as we see before, setup, draw, mouse pressed, these are all functions in that they have names. They have a certain block of code that will get executed when we call it with that name, and we can call them from anywhere else after they're defined. Setup and draw, mostly they just get called from run when we have that at the end of the code, but something like mouse pressed, we can call that from anywhere. Okay, so what is the point of creating functions? Well, by packaging blocks of code into functions, we can reduce the amount of code we need to write, reuse blocks of code that have known behavior that we want to reproduce, and recycle the code using different inputs. So it's basically just for efficiency. We don't want to be writing the same code multiple times, same thing with loops, so we can create functions that can be called from multiple places. Uh, Short analogy for this, we can have a car. A car has many components, and each one can be thought of as a function that has a distinct purpose each time we call it. So let's say every time we press the gas pedal, car moves forward. Anytime we move the steering wheel, it'll change directions. Anytime we press the brake pedal, it'll slow down. So those are each things we can call by using one of these things, and they each do a specific thing. So these kind of serve to simplify the mechanisms of the car. And additionally, most of the time when we call a function, they will have an input and an output. So for example, pressing the gas pedal, input will happen when your foot presses the pedal. Then we have a certain process. This would be like a block of code that gets executed. In this case, it'll make more gas flow into the engine, piston in the engine will move faster, and the wheels will spin with more force. The output then is that the car moves faster. But in this case, we kind of don't really need to worry about the process in the middle as long as we have this input and this output that we can control. All right, here's some more examples of predefined functions that we've used already. Um, so we've used print, that's a function. You can pass in text and it will print it to the terminal. That's pretty easy to use. first one we learned. Um, we've used ellipse, fill, background. These each do their own purposes. This will draw an ellipse to the screen. This will change the color of shapes that you draw after it, and this will change the color of the background. Each function typically just does a single action. So in addition to performing a single action, some functions will give a return value after they are called. This is not needed for every function, but many functions will do this. So a few examples. We talked about the len function in regards to lists. So we can pass in a list or any other type of container, and it will have a return value that gives you the length, the number of objects in that container. Another example we talked about briefly at the end of last session, the random randint function. So here we have arguments that we pass into the function. So we pass in 0 and 10, and then it will return a random value in between 0 and 10. So those are examples of functions that have return values. Okay, another example. Why do we use functions? If we wanted to draw a town with lots of houses, the code would look like this without using functions. Disgusting. Same code repeated so many times. So inefficient. What if we used functions? Okay, now we have a function to draw a house. We can call it multiple times from our setup function with different coordinates of where we want the houses to be. And look how much shorter and easier to read this is. Easier to code, easier to work with, much just easier in general. Okay, so what we learned so far, we're going to get started on our first quick question. So question number 1 is, which of the following is false? A, functions can be utilized as reusable chunks of code. B, functions should be used to perform one specific action. C, functions can only be called in draw. D, there is no limit on how many times you can call a function. So again, you all should have access to these slides. If you don't, I can drop the link in the chat. But yeah, look back through the slides if you need to. And answer the question, which one is false? Right, yeah, let's see here. 17 out of 18, 18 out of 18. Seems like that's everyone. All right, let's show responses. 19 out of 19. Okay, and anyone else not joined? Not quite sure. Number's still going up. Okay, yeah, 22 out of 22. I'm guessing that's everyone. So, show responses. Okay, yeah, looks pretty good. So, those of you who answered C, that is the correct answer. Or more accurately, the incorrect answer, because functions can be called from anywhere in your program, not just from draw. So that is the false statement. The rest of these statements, definitely true. Functions can be utilized as reusable chunks of code, as we discussed. Functions should be used to perform one specific action. They don't necessarily have to, but that is just best practice for how to use functions. And yes, there is no limit on how many times you can call a function. Use it as many times as you want. Okay, so let's look at how we define functions in Python. So here is the breakdown of what a function will look like. We always define functions using the def keyword for define. We've seen this already for setup and draw. So any other function we want to define, we use the def keyword, same way we would with those functions. So we have def, then in our definition we give it a name, and then we have brackets that may or may not have parameters in them. So as we can see here, parameters are optional. If you want to pass parameters into your function, you can, but it is not required. So as I've seen before, not every function will have parameters that we pass to it. So we have name, parentheses, with parameters in them, and then colon to show where the function starts. And after that, we'll have the function body. So we'll have an indent after def, same way we would with setup and draw. And we have some code here that we execute. So that is the function body. And then at the end of the function, we can have a return value if we want our function to return something. Yeah, okay, so this is just going over all of the pieces of the function. So all functions have a name. Here's an example of function called greeting. So we would call it greeting, and then from anywhere else in our code, we can call greeting and it'll execute some code in the function body. So here's an example of some code we could put in that body. So let's say if we call the function greeting, we want to print hello to the terminal. We can do that with this. And that's basically one of the simplest functions we can do. So we have the name greeting, we have the body with one line that prints hello everyone, and we can call that from somewhere else. So when we create these functions, make sure we're creating them outside of setup and draw so that we can call them from within other functions. So here's an example of a function call. So if we want to call it from within setup, we have our greeting function defined down here. And then from setup, we can call greeting with the same name we defined it with, and then it will execute that code that prints hello everyone. Okay, so let's look at an exercise where we'll create a function. So here we want to create a function called random circle that gets called when the mouse is pressed. So the function should draw a circle at the mouse position with a random diameter within this range and a random color. So let's look at some things we might need to use to do this. One thing would be how we can get random colors. So think about RGB. We want to get random values for each of those to create a random color. So think about how many random numbers you need. Additionally, we want to have random size as well. So you can look at using the random randint function we discussed at the end of last session to do that, as well as the random colors. And if we want to call this function each time the mouse is pressed, take a look at the mouse pressed function at the beginning of these slides that we discussed at the beginning. So that should be everything you need to complete this exercise. And with that, we're just going to go into breakout rooms for the next couple minutes. Okay, we got everyone coming back. most of us direct. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, so I just want to go over, I saw two slightly different solutions for this, so I'm gonna actually go over both of them. So here's the first one, and this is kind of similar to the example we saw on the slides where we define mouse pressed as a function. And if we do it this way, this function will get called anytime we press the mouse button. So it'll work something like this, where each click of the mouse will create a different circle. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is use mouse pressed as a statement within an if statement. So of course, this will return true or false, depending on whether our mouse button is pressed or held down. So let's look at what this does. And if we do it this way, we don't need our mouse pressed function anymore. And this will behave slightly differently because it will call this function anytime mouse press is true. So we can hold down the mouse button and it will just call that function continuously. So that's how that one would work. And as for the function itself, as we can see here, we're passing in our mouse x and mouse y values. We're using randint to create random diameter, random value for red, green, and blue. And then we're just using those to create our different colored ellipses here, as you can see. So yeah, that kind of goes to show there's multiple ways to think about this problem. Neither of these are like right or wrong. I just want to show that there's a couple different ways to do it based on what we've learned so far. So with that, we're gonna move on to, how did we get back here? Function parameters, yes. So parameters are optional variables that are used as inputs by the function. So as we saw earlier, we didn't technically need to pass mouse x and mouse y into the function. We can just use those in the function itself, but that's a way to do it. We can pass those variables into the function and then have them used by the function itself. So just a reminder, you don't actually set the value of the parameters in the function definition. The value gets passed in when you call the function. So here's an example of a function that takes two parameters and will print the sum of those two inputs. So this add function will take the parameters a and b, and it will add a and b together and then print the sum. So if we call this from setup, this is where we are actually defining the values of a and b. Because if we call add with the inputs 3 and 5, then within the add function, it knows that a is equal to 3 and b is equal to 5. And then when we go through the function body, we see that sum is then equal to a plus b, which is 8, and then we print sum, so we print 8. So make sure you're keeping the order of the parameters within the function call and within the function definition the same, because the order is important. If you have a first and then b, it needs to be the same for both of them. Okay, so that's kind of a quick example, but we're going to go over a quick question for how to use functions. So this one, we need to fill in the blanks. So we have a function call and a function definition, and we need to figure out what goes in each of these blanks. So I want to make sure I can show both of these at once.
Okay, quick question 2. Not in full screen. And fill in the blanks. Okay, I'm seeing 20 out of 20. We had 22 out of 22 before, though. So I can give a couple more seconds here. Okay, 22 out of 22. Seems like that's everyone. So we can show responses. Okay, yes. Those of you who answered B, that is the correct answer. So let's take a look at what we're doing in each of these blanks. So in the first blank, we have a function call. And so if this is a function call, we want to call the function with the name we defined it as. So in this case, we defined our function divide by 3. So here we're calling divide by 3. So blank 1 is divide by 3. So that limits us to A and B. And then in blank 2, we want to define our parameter. So here we have kind of two variables. We have result and number. And see, result is defined in this line, but number needs to be defined somewhere. So if we define this parameter as number, then whatever number we pass in will be used as the parameter number, and then we divide it by 3 and then print the result. So that would do what we expect this function to do. Okay, and with that, let's move on. Okay, and the last part of the function we need to go over is the return value of the function. So this is what the function is going to give back when it finishes executing its instructions. So return value can be anything. Any of the data types we've learned so far, strings, integers, booleans, etc. So here's a function with a return value that has no input parameters and just returns an integer. So anytime we call this function 2 plus 2, it will give us the return value of answer, which will be 2 plus 2. 4 is stored in answer, and then if we return answer, the value will get stored in x, because we're defining the return value of this function to x. Here's another example. So if we want to create a function called calculate square area, that will return whatever side length we passed in multiplied by itself. So here we can see us assigning this area to the variable area, and then from there we can use it anywhere else in the code. Okay, lastly, we are going to have an exercise to tie all these concepts together. And what we're going to do with this, we're going to create a function named average that will return the average of the inputs x and y. And when the mouse is pressed, we will call the function average, pass in mouse x and mouse y as parameters, draw an ellipse at the position of the mouse with the return value of average as the diameter. So yeah, a couple different things. We have a function call, and then we're using the return value from that call to draw an ellipse with that size. So if the diameter is the average of the x and y positions, we basically just need to write a function that can compute this equation if we pass in x and y. So give us some time to figure this out. Okay. Do we have everyone back yet? Seems so. Breakout rooms are closed. So let's go over this solution. So this should look very similar to our last exercise. It's actually a bit easier since we don't have to deal with random values. And we don't really have to deal with colors either. So a few things we have to do. So similarly, we have our if mouse pressed. Alternatively, we can define mouse pressed as a function. We're just going to go with this option for now. We define no fill. So we get clear circles. And we want to define our diameter with the return value of our average function. So we can define our function up here. Very simple function, just takes in two parameters x and y and returns the average computed with this formula. And we use both the x and y coordinates of the mouse and the diameter to draw our ellipses, like that. Okay, so just have one more slide here, and then we can wrap up and go to end of session exercises. So just like in draw and setup, if we want to use global variables within our functions, we can use the global keyword. So this is pretty straightforward. It works the exact same way it does in our setup and draw functions. So if we wanted to use the variable health within that function, we just define global health, and then this health corresponds to this health, and we can use it within this function. Okay, so that is all we really have for today. So we're just going to go over end of session exercises. So here are the exercises for bug busters. Yeah, as we can see here, we have some hints in the speaker notes if you want to go through that, but we have a few different exercises. First one, this is just creating faces using ellipses wherever you press the mouse button. You can look at using a function for this that will just draw the different ellipses you need for each face, and that will make this so much easier because you can just call that function anytime you click the mouse, similar to how we've done so far. And this is another one for abstract art. This would also ideally be defined in a function that creates a certain number of random rectangles with random sizes and colors. And those will change each time you press the mouse. Okay, Pythonic lava is a bit more difficult. We have the targets one. This one isn't really clear what it does, so I'm just going to go over to the speaker notes. We want to create a function that draws dartboards at a given x and y position, and the number of rings is dependent on the size of the dartboard. And then we're calling that function 3 times. And the car one, we have our simple car. Again, this car can kind of be as complex as you want it to be. This is a very fancy one. It can honestly just be a rectangle. That's not really the point of the exercise. But we have a function called find lane that will take in the parameter x position and will return either left lane, middle lane, or right lane. And we use that to create this text. So those are our exercises. We have a few just for fun exercises as well. So you can take a look at these if you have time. Again, links for submissions. And also, we have our midway feedback form. So if you can, I'm also going to drop this link in the chat. Please take a few minutes to fill out this feedback form so we can hear what you have to say about how our sessions are going so far. There's that form. And with that, the rest of this time will be used to work on those exercises. So we can go ahead and open breakout rooms.